The first thing I noticed was the smell of dry erase marker. The second thing was that my face was mashed against a laminate desk, and my neck was making a sound like a rusty hinge when I lifted it. I am, or rather I was, Daniel Brooks, 24 years old, line cook at a mid-tier steakhouse in Tacoma, Washington, professional expert in 12-hour shifts, cheap energy drinks, and the exact temperature at which a ribeye stops being medium rare. My last memory was face-planting onto my own couch after a Saturday night rush, too tired to even take my shoes off. This was not my couch. This was a classroom. And judging by the acne on the kid next to me and the height of the desk against my thighs, I was not 24 anymore. Then the download hit, not a memory, but information, slamming into my skull like somebody had backed a delivery truck into my brain. Character bios, plot points, a whole trashy web novel's worth of drama, unloading itself directly into my consciousness. I was Daniel Brooks. Still Daniel Brooks, weirdly. My new old body had kept the name, which felt like the universe was too lazy to even give me a decent alias, 16 years old. Junior at Blackwood Preparatory Academy, a private school on a hill overlooking Lake Washington, where the parking lot had more Teslas than the dealership I used to walk past on my way to work. And I was the villain. Not a villain. The villain. The designated bully in a romance novel called Alpha's Golden Boy, whose entire narrative function was to make life miserable for the male-led William Ashford, until I got humiliated in front of the whole school and faded into background scenery, while William fell in love with somebody else. Great, fantastic, love that for me. William Ashford, 17 Alpha Junior Class President, captain of the Blackwood Ravens lacrosse team, heir to the Ashford Group, a Seattle-based real estate and hospitality dynasty with its name on half the waterfront hotels between here and Bellevue, reportedly allergic to smiling. Quick pause before we dive further into this mess. If slow burn, rivals to lovers, way too many naps, romance is your thing, go ahead and hit follow now so you don't miss what happens next. Okay. Back to Daniel's very bad Monday. I knew all of this because the novel's plot was currently playing in my head like a movie I never asked to watch. And the scene that was about to happen, the scene I was literally sitting inside of, was the opening humiliation. Old Daniel's masterstroke. 2 nights ago, apparently, he'd broken into the front office and swapped William's college recommendation essay, the one his guidance counselor was reading aloud at this morning's fall convocation, in front of the entire junior and senior class as an example of excellence. With a plagiarized essay old Daniel had bought off some sketchy website. The switch was a delayed bomb. It would go off in exactly 40 minutes at the assembly, and William Ashford, Golden Boy, Alpha, future CEO, was going to stand at a podium and get accused of academic fraud in front of 600 of his peers. I sat with that information for a second, the way you sit with news that your car got towed, not quite believing it, hoping if you wait long enough it'll turn out to be a mistake. It was not a mistake. The download kept going, unhelpfully thorough, filling in details I never asked for. Old Daniel's favorite insult. Old Daniel's GPA. A personal insult to numbers everywhere. Old Daniel's entire 5-year plan, which, as far as I could tell, consisted of make William Ashford's life hell and nothing else. No backup plan, no hobbies, not even a part-time job. This kid had poured every ounce of teenage energy into a grudge, and here I was, a grown man who'd once worked a double on Thanksgiving and still had the emotional bandwidth to tip the dishwasher extra, inheriting his crusade. Homeroom smelled like whiteboard cleaner and somebody's energy drink. Fluorescent lights buzzed directly into my skull like they were personally invested in my headache. Around me, kids were pulling out notebooks, and I realized with growing horror that I recognized none of them, that my hands didn't feel like my hands, that the voice in my head when I thought what the hell is happening came out an octave higher than I expected when I accidentally said it out loud. The kid behind me, a stranger, apparently a friend of old Daniel's, leaned forward. "You good, man? You look like you saw a ghost." "I am the ghost," I muttered, which, considering the situation, felt uncomfortably accurate, and then I thought about my old job. 12-hour shifts. A manager named Gary who screamed about ticket times like the fate of the free world hinged on medium rare arriving 4 minutes faster. Standing on my feet until my knees filed a formal complaint with the rest of my body, coming home smelling like fry oil no amount of showering could fully remove. You know what that job had that this body apparently didn't? Breaks. Actual, sanctioned, 15-minute breaks where nobody expected you to plot revenge against a golden boy classmate. I decided, somewhere between first bell and the Pledge of Allegiance, that whatever this new life was going to look like, it was going to have more of those. I looked at the kid 2 rows up, William Ashford, spine so straight he looked like he'd been assembled by a furniture company, dark hair that had probably never once been messy in its life. Even from behind, he radiated the specific energy of somebody who'd never eaten a gas station burrito at 2 a.m. and lived to regret it. The old me, 16-year-old resentful bully me, had spent, according to the download, actual hours engineering this humiliation, sneaking into the office, forging a fake essay, timing the assembly reveal. That was more prep work than I used to put into a wedding catering order. I could not, physically or spiritually, be bothered. But also, and this was the part that surprised even me, I didn't actually want to watch some kid get torn apart in public over something I did. I'd had bosses humiliate me in front of customers before. It's not character building, it just sucks. So, with the enthusiasm of a man doing inventory, I got up, walked to the front office during the 5 minutes before homeroom while the secretary was on a coffee run, dug through the manila folder helpfully labeled convocation. Speechies, found the fake essay sitting right on top like old Daniel had wanted a participation trophy for effort, and swapped it back with the real one, which I found crumpled in my own backpack. I didn't even bother being subtle about it. I was too tired for subtle. Then I went back to homeroom, put my hood up, folded my arms on the desk, and went to sleep before the bell even rang. At the assembly, Mr. Whitfield, the guidance counselor, read William Ashford's actual, real, extremely good essay about up in his father's shadow and wanting to build something that was his own for once. People clapped. William stood at the podium looking mildly stunned that his own words had, in fact, come out of the folder correctly, for reasons he could not identify. I know this because I was told about it later. I slept through the entire assembly, sitting upright in a folding chair, hood up, snoring softly enough that the kid next to me thought it was the HVAC system. William didn't know it was me. Not yet. All he knew was that the essay he'd turned in a week ago, the one he'd rewritten 4 times because his father said the first draft sounded soft, had somehow ended up exactly where it was supposed to be, word for word, comma for comma. He double-checked with Mr. Whitfield that nothing had been altered, nothing had. He didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when he caught new Daniel Brooks sound asleep in the back of AP Government, drooling slightly on a stack of untouched homework, and something about the sight made him stop in the doorway a half-second too long. Blackwood Prep ran on a rumor economy, and the currency that week was what is wrong with Daniel Brooks. Blackwood, I quickly learned from the download and confirmed through several deeply awkward real-time observations, ran on the same social hierarchy as half the rest of the country. Alphas at the top, mostly, team captains, class presidents, the kids whose family names were on buildings, betas making up the vast, unbothered middle, and omegas somewhere in a social bracket that ranged from protected to patronized, depending on which alpha you asked. Nobody had ever bothered explaining any of it to me directly. You were just supposed to absorb it, the way you absorb which lunch table not to sit at. I was a beta, according to the download, which meant nobody expected much of me either way, socially or hormonally, and frankly that suited me fine. Old Daniel had apparently spent an embarrassing amount of energy resenting William for being an alpha with everything handed to him. New Daniel mostly just resented that alpha status came with mandatory 7 a.m. leadership breakfasts that occasionally interrupted my sleep schedule by association. By Wednesday, theories had escalated well past reasonable. Somebody in AP Bio started a rumor that I'd joined a monastery over the weekend. A sophomore I'd never spoken to swore up and down that I'd suffered a concussion at football practice, despite the fact that Blackwood didn't have a football team, and I had never in this life or my last willingly run toward a ball of any kind. My personal favorite was the theory that I was secretly dying of something tragic and cinematic, which explained the napping, the sudden calm, and the general vibe of a man who had made peace with his mortality. That one got me an alarming number of sympathy cookies left on my desk by girls I'd never met, which, free cookies, I did not correct. The old Daniel had been a known quantity, a beta with a bad attitude, decent grades he didn't try for, and 3 loyal cronies who followed him around like nervous geese. The new Daniel, me, slept through everything, homeroom, lunch. The 5 minutes between classes, during which I discovered you actually can nap standing against a locker if you commit hard enough. My old crew tried to stage an intervention. Tyler Grant, 16, beta, self-appointed leader of what used to be my friend group, wears his Letterman jacket like it's a personality trait. Bro? Tyler hissed at me during lunch, sliding into the seat across from my tray of untouched tater tots. What's the plan? You're just gonna let Ashford walk around like nothing happened? He owes us a public L. I opened one eye. Who? William Ashford, your nemesis. The guy whose whole life you've dedicated yourself to ruining since freshman year. I considered this with the gravity of a man being asked to solve a calculus problem at 3 a.m. Sounds like a lot of work, I said, and put my head back down on my arms. Nap time. Tyler and his two friends exchanged the exact look you'd give a car that had started making a noise you didn't recognize. Their leader had gone rogue, and nobody knew why. They tried again at lunch 2 days later, which is how I found myself cornered at the end of a cafeteria table by 3 teenagers staging what was, effectively, an ambush intervention over chicken tenders. Seriously, man, Marcus said, dropping his tray across from me with a clatter loud enough to make the whole table jump. People are saying you smiled at him. In the library. Sarah saw it. Sarah needs a hobby, I said, and put my head down on my folded arms, which, even I'll admit, was starting to become my signature move, like a tennis player's serve or a boxer's stance. You're supposed to hate him, Tyler pressed, leaning in like he was delivering classified information. It's like the whole point of you. Everyone knows that. It's basically your job. I quit, I said, muffled by my own arm. Effective immediately. No 2 weeks' notice. Sue me. You can't just quit being somebody's nemesis. Watch me. I lifted my head just enough to steal a tater tot off his tray, which felt like the appropriate level of chaos to end the conversation, and put my head back down. Somewhere across the cafeteria I could feel, without looking, a specific gaze land on the back of my hood and stay there a beat too long. I didn't need to check to know whose it was. I was getting alarmingly good at sensing it, like a smoke detector for one very particular alpha. William, meanwhile, was going through something I can only describe as withdrawal from conflict. He'd spent 2 years bracing for a rivalry, the sneaking, the scheming, the low-grade psychological warfare that old Daniel had specialized in. Instead, he got a sleeping bag with a GPA. He told me later, much later, once his ears had stopped turning red every time he admitted things, that he'd started watching me the way you watch a pot you're not sure is actually boiling. He kept a mental log without meaning to. I preferred sleeping on my left side. My brow furrowed faintly whenever a teacher mentioned calculus, like even my subconscious had opinions about quadratics. During a physics lecture on momentum, he got so distracted wondering whether I was actually asleep or just faking that he missed an entire unit conversion and had to redo it for homework. The great William Ashford, undefeated in every academic category since the 4th grade, losing an argument to a nap he wasn't even part of. He tried testing me once, in a small way, said my name during a pop quiz roll call a beat too sharply, watching for a reaction. I mumbled something that may or may not have been a real word and didn't lift my head an inch. He told me later that the sheer, uncomplicated peace of my non-reaction unsettled him more than any comeback could have. He wasn't used to being ignored. He definitely wasn't used to liking it. The first time he actually cornered me was in the library, 3 days later, and it did not go the way either of us expected. I was in the back corner, in the good armchair by the window that nobody else had claimed yet, a book open on my chest that I had zero intention of reading. William walked over, stood in front of me, and cast a full dramatic shadow across the page like he'd rehearsed it. You, he said, low voice, cold. The kind of voice that probably worked great on freshmen and lacrosse refs. My eyes fluttered open, adjusted slowly to the fact that there was a large, unfairly attractive teenager blocking my window light. What's your game? The silent treatment, waiting for me to let my guard down? His jaw was doing something tight and controlled. I know it was you, the essay. Mr. Whitfield checked the security footage. You were in the office that morning. Ah. So that was going to come up eventually. I really should have thought that through. I looked at him for a long, blank moment, the kind of moment that, from the outside, probably read as menacing, but was actually me trying to remember if I'd left the stove on in my old apartment, a habit that apparently survived transmigration. Yeah, I said finally. That was me. His whole posture changed, coiled tighter, ready for the trap, whatever angle I was working. Why? Because doing the essay switch sounded exhausting, I said honestly, and sat up a little, rubbing my eyes. And unswitching it sounded like 5 minutes of effort, and 5 minutes was cheaper than watching you get humiliated in front of 600 people over something I did. I don't actually enjoy watching people suffer. Turns out that's more of a hobby thing, and I don't have hobbies. I have naps. William Ashford stood there processing this with the expression of a man whose calculator had just told him 2 plus 2 equals a sandwich. You switched it back, he said slowly, like the words needed testing. Yep, why would you? He stopped, started again. Nobody's ever done anything for me without wanting something back. And there it was, not said dramatically, not said for sympathy, just said flatly, factually, the way you'd report the weather. Something about the plainness of it landed somewhere in my chest that I hadn't expected a burnt-out line cook's soul to still have feelings in. So what, you just decided to stop? He said it like the concept physically pained him, a straight-A student encountering a math problem with no solution. 2 years of this, and you just decided to stop? Some people find religion, I said. I found napping. Equally life-changing, way less homework. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. I'm not a deep well of tragic backstory, Ashford. I'm a guy who got tired. Which was, funnily enough, the single truest sentence old Daniel's mouth had produced in this entire novel. He studied me like I was a locked door he was trying to find the hinge on. Up close, in the afternoon light through the library window, I noticed the specific way his jaw tightened when he was thinking hard, like his brain physically needed his whole face to help. Well, I said, settling back into the armchair, already fighting my eyelids again. Consider this the one exception. Don't get used to it. I'm not going to be interesting twice in one semester. I was asleep again in under a minute. William Ashford stood over that armchair for a full 60 seconds. He told me, later, red-eared, that he'd counted, before he shoved his hands in his blazer pockets and walked out of the library feeling more unsettled than he had in the 2 years he'd spent bracing for a war that, apparently, wasn't coming. Word travels fast at a school with 600 kids and even less to do. By the following week, half of Blackwood had a theory about the essay thing, and William, allegedly, had developed a habit of finding excuses to walk past my desk. The opportunity that actually got us in a room together came from Mrs. Alvarez, our homeroom teacher, who had officially run out of patience. Daniel Brooks. She snapped her fingers in front of my face during third period, and I surfaced from my hoodie like a groundhog checking for its shadow. That's it. You are failing 4 classes. You will attend mandatory tutoring after school today, and you will not leave until you've completed 3 practice problems. I felt something close to physical pain. Tutoring meant no nap. Tutoring meant effort. Before I could even formulate a groan, a hand went up 2 rows over. I'll tutor him. William's voice was even, controlled, the picture of civic duty. It'll be more efficient. I already have a study system. The room went dead silent. The class president offering to tutor the guy who'd tried to publicly destroy him 3 weeks ago? Mrs. Alvarez blinked twice, but the math checked out. William had the highest GPA in the junior class, by a comfortable margin. Well, yes, that's very responsible of you, William. I shot him a look that was somewhere between a glare and a plea. Why are you doing this to me? He didn't answer. He just looked very briefly, extremely pleased with himself, in the understated way of somebody who has never once let his face do anything without permission. An hour later, we were alone in the empty classroom, late afternoon, sun slicing orange across the desks, and William had a textbook open and a look of grim determination. Okay, he said, pointing at a problem. If x equals 7, you substitute it into the equation. I looked at the numbers. They looked like ants. Angry, judgmental little ants that had personally wronged me in a past life, possibly this one. Daniel. Are you listening? Which is Daniel Brooks for absolutely not. He sighed, the specific sigh of somebody watching a car slowly roll toward a ditch and being physically unable to stop it, and I felt my head start its inevitable descent toward the desk. His hand caught my chin before I hit wood. I blinked. He was closer than I expected, one arm braced on the back of my chair, his fingers warm against my jaw, and for a second neither of us moved. I could see up close that his eyes weren't actually the flat gray I'd assumed from a distance. They had gold in them, warm when the light hit right. At least pretend to try, he said. His voice had lost its edge somewhere in the last 3 seconds. "I contain multitudes," I said. "None of them involve trying." He huffed, not quite a laugh, but close, and let go of my chin slowly, like he was doing it against his own advice. His ears, I noticed, had gone a faint, traitorous pink. We did not finish problem 1. I was asleep within 5 minutes, and William, instead of being annoyed, the way I fully expected, just sat there and watched the sun move across the back of my hoodie, like it was the most interesting documentary he'd ever seen. He told me, months later, that this was the exact moment he stopped thinking of me as a problem to solve and started thinking of me as something else entirely. He didn't have a word for the something else yet. He was 17 and an alpha who'd been raised to treat feelings like a design flaw. Give the guy a break. The sessions kept happening and kept failing academically in increasingly creative ways. William tried flashcards. I used them as a bookmark for a nap I hadn't started yet. He tried word problems, disguised as things a junior in high school might theoretically care about. If you have 30 vocabulary words and you learn 5 before falling asleep, how many are left? Which briefly worked, purely because I got competitive about the number. Before I remembered, I didn't actually have to care about vocabulary anymore, and fell promptly back asleep mid-sentence. "You did that on purpose," he accused one afternoon, watching me startle awake from a fake snore I'd been maintaining for comedic effect. "I would never," I said, deeply unconvincing, and he threw his pencil at me, which bounced off my shoulder and rolled under the radiator, where, as far as I know, it remains to this day, a small yellow monument to his suffering. It started unofficially with a paper ball. We were in AP Government, a class we happened to share third period, and William, 3 rows over, allegedly taking notes on the judicial branch, had apparently reached his limit of watching me sleep through a unit he found personally fascinating. He crumpled a scrap of loose leaf into a tight little sphere and, with a flick of his wrist that suggested actual lacrosse-honed precision, lobbed it at my desk. It bounced off my hood and hit the floor. I didn't move, didn't twitch. My breathing didn't even change rhythm. I felt, rather than saw, the specific quality of his disappointment radiate 3 rows over like a space heater running out of batteries. It was, objectively, an absurd thing to be disappointed about, a boy upset that a sleeping guy hadn't reacted to being hit with paper, and yet. He tried again next period, a little harder, a direct hit square on the crown of my hood. I raised one hand from under the desk in a slow, deliberate arc, batted at my own head like I was shooing a particularly persistent mosquito, and let my hand flop back down. Didn't open my eyes, didn't need to. A short, startled laugh escaped him before he could stop it, sharp and real, nothing like his usual controlled exhale of amusement, and I heard 3 separate chairs creak as people turned to check whether the actual sky had fallen. William Ashford did not laugh out loud in class. William Ashford had, as far as anyone knew, never laughed out loud anywhere. He clapped a hand over his own mouth like he'd been caught committing a crime. I still didn't open my eyes, but I let myself smile, just slightly, into the crook of my elbow, where nobody but the desk could see it. The tutoring sessions became a routine nobody scheduled and nobody canceled. Every day after the final bell, William would end up at my desk, and I would end up asleep within the first 10 minutes of any academic content, and somehow this counted as spending time together. He noticed, one Tuesday, that I'd been using my balled-up hoodie sleeve as a pillow and wincing every time I shifted my neck. I'd tried, briefly, to get revenge for the paper ball incident by accidentally leaving a sticky note on his lacrosse helmet that said "Prophecy of the Sleeping Guy, do not disturb, villators will be noggered," which he found before practice, read with a completely straight face in front of his entire team, and then folded very carefully into his pocket instead of throwing away. A detail I only learned because his teammate Andre told half the junior class about it, mystified, like he'd witnessed a religious event. I considered this an overwhelming victory and retired from pranking while ahead. He didn't say anything about any of it. He just showed up the next day with an actual pillow, small, navy, suspiciously well made for something a 17-year-old had, apparently, just had lying around, and set it on my desk before I got there, then buried his face back in a textbook like he hadn't done anything at all. I stopped in the doorway, stared at the pillow, stared at William, aggressively not looking at me, stared back at the pillow. A slow, involuntary smile spread across my face. Not a smirk, not sarcasm, just genuinely embarrassingly touched, in the way you get touched by small kindnesses when you've spent your adult life mostly getting yelled at by a kitchen manager named Gary. "Thanks," I said, voice still rough with sleep I hadn't even had yet, and sat down and put my head on the pillow and was asleep in under a minute. William didn't look up. But I know, because a freshman told me later in a tone of pure scandal, that the second I was fully out, he'd reached over, carefully, like diffusing a bomb, and adjusted the pillow so it sat better under my cheek. The following week he escalated. Seattle in October means the classroom got cold fast once the sun dropped, and one Thursday, without a word, he stood up mid-tutoring session, produced an actual cashmere throw blanket from his backpack, like he was a magician pulling off a trick he'd rehearsed 40 times, and draped it over my shoulders with a level of care usually reserved for museum artifacts. That's the exact moment a freshman named Cooper walked in, looking for a forgotten textbook, and found William Ashford, Alpha, Ice King, terrifier of underclassmen, tucking a blanket around the school's most notorious sleeping delinquent with an expression so soft it looked physically wrong on his face. Cooper made a small, strangled sound. William's head snapped up, and for half a second the old iciness flickered back into his eyes. Then he clocked the sheer horror on Cooper's face, and instead of threatening him, which was everyone's assumption, he just raised one finger to his lips. "Shh. Don't you dare wake him up." Cooper fled the room so fast he left the door swinging, and by lunch the next day, the entire sophomore class had heard some version of the story, each one more dramatic than the last, until by third period people were saying, "William Ashford had personally knit me a sweater." I woke up eventually, warm and cocooned, and found him back at his desk pretending intensely to read a chapter he'd already finished twice. "This is nice," I said, testing the blanket's edge between two fingers. "Suspiciously nice. Did you steal this from a 5-star hotel?" "It's cashmere," he said, not looking up, in the exact tone of a man who would rather discuss the judicial branch again than admit he'd bought it specifically for me. "Cashmere. For me. The guy who once threw an exam paper in the trash out of spite. I'm aware of your history," he said. "I was there. So why the blanket, Ashford?" He finally looked up, and something in his expression, caught, a little defensive, entirely too fond for a guy who was supposedly still mad at me 3 weeks ago, made my chest do a small, unfamiliar flip. "Because you looked cold," he said simply, like that settled the entire matter, and went back to his book before his ears could finish turning red. I decided, watching him, not to push it further. Some victories you just get to sit quietly inside of. Not everyone found the new arrangement charming. Tyler and his crew had gone from confused to bitter, feeling, not unreasonably, abandoned by their former ringleader, who now apparently belonged to the enemy. They cornered me outside the stairwell one afternoon, before I could make it to our usual classroom. "Well, well," Tyler sneered, flanked by his 2 remaining loyalists, Marcus and Brandon, who both looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. "If it isn't Ashford's little pet, following him around, letting him spoil you. Pathetic." I looked at them the way you look at a fly that's landed on your sandwich, mildly annoyed, mostly just wanting it gone so you can eat in peace. "Where's your spine, huh?" Marcus added, stepping closer, clearly trying to earn back some captain energy. "Gonna go cry to your new best friend." Before I could even summon the energy for a sarcastic response, genuinely, formulating sentences before 3 p.m. was above my pay grade, a voice cut through the hallway from behind them, flat and cold enough to lower the room temperature by 10 degrees. He won't need to. William stepped out from the stairwell, blazer still buttoned, expression arranged into something I'd started thinking of as his boardroom face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You have 5 seconds to remove yourselves from my line of sight," he said, "or I will personally forward the security footage of last month's parking lot incident, complete with timestamps, to Principal Kessler and your parents." A pause, perfectly timed. "Tyler, I believe your father sits on the same country club board as mine. Small world." Nobody in this school doubted that William Ashford followed through on things. The 3 of them scattered like pigeons at a car horn, Tyler nearly tripping over his own backpack in the process, which, small mercies, I got to watch happen in real time. "You didn't have to do that," I said, once the stairwell had gone quiet again, though something warm was uncoiling in my chest at the sight of him standing there, jaw still tight with leftover anger on my behalf. "I had it handled. You had your hand halfway into your pocket. presumably reaching for absolutely nothing because you don't carry anything useful in there besides gum wrappers, William said, some of the ice finally melting out of his voice. You weren't handling it. You were tolerating it, which isn't the same thing. Tomato, tomato. Daniel, fine. Thank you, you're very intimidating. It's a good look on you. I inherited a real estate empire, and I'm not afraid to use it. That finally got the ghost of a smile out of him. His gaze softened the second they were gone, landing on me with an intensity that made my chest do something unfamiliar. He crossed the hallway, grabbed my wrist, not roughly, but firm, sure of himself, and pulled me past the stairwell, up another flight, through a door marked staff only that he clearly had zero business having a key to. We came out onto the roof. It was a hidden little world up there, an old bench, a view of Lake Washington going gold and pink with the sunset, the whole city laid out like it existed just for the two of us to look at. You don't have to deal with them, William said, and his voice had dropped somewhere I hadn't heard it go before. Quieter, rawer. Not ever again. They're not worth your time. He pushed me gently, down onto the bench. Just rest, he said. I'll keep watch. I looked up at him, the real concern on his face, the fierce, unguarded protectiveness that a guy who'd spent his whole life performing composure clearly wasn't used to letting show. Something warm cracked open in my chest, warmer than any blanket he'd smuggled out of his mother's linen closet. Without really deciding to, I leaned sideways and put my head on his shoulder. He went rigid for a second. I felt it, the whole body flinch of somebody who'd never been touched like this and wasn't sure what to do with it, and then slowly he relaxed. His arm came up, hesitant, and settled around my waist. You know, I mumbled, already half on, for a guy with an Ice King reputation, you've got a pretty soft heart under all that Letterman jacket energy. Don't tell anyone, he said, and I could hear the smile in it even without opening my eyes. I have a reputation to protect. Your secret's safe. I don't have the energy to gossip. That, he said, quiet, almost to himself, might be the best thing about you. The sunset was beautiful. But the steady thud of his heart under my ear was better. And it was there, on a rooftop in Seattle, with a boy I'd known for exactly 3 weeks, that I fell asleep feeling, for the first time since I'd woken up in this body, genuinely safe. He woke me an hour later, gently, when the sky had gone fully dark and the lake lights had come on below us, like scattered stars that had fallen the wrong direction. Neither of us mentioned how long he'd let me sleep on him without moving, even though his arm had definitely gone numb. Some things you just let stay unspoken, filed away under things that mattered more than they should have. The roof couldn't protect me from Seattle weather. A cold front rolled in off the Sound that weekend, the kind that turned the lake gunmetal gray and drove even the ducks into hiding, and I, because sleeping through your own life extends to sleeping through the forecast, walked home Friday in nothing but a thin hoodie, hands shoved in my pockets, telling myself it wasn't that cold right up until it very much was. By Monday, I was a disaster. I made it to my desk, but I wasn't sleeping. I was shivering, pale except for 2 hot spots high on my cheeks, my whole body one long, miserable ache. William noticed before the bell even finished ringing. He always noticed. But this wasn't my usual peaceful stillness. This was wrong, and he knew it in under 10 seconds. He got up mid-lecture, ignoring the stares, and pressed the back of his hand to my forehead. You're burning up, he said, low and tight. I made a sound that was probably meant to be words, and came out as more of a whimper. Something in his expression cracked. He walked to the front of the room and told our teacher, in a tone that left zero room for negotiation, that he was taking me to the nurse. It was not a request. The school nurse took one look at me and put me on a cot. William pulled a chair beside it and sat down like he had no intention of leaving, which, when the nurse suggested he get back to class, he confirmed with a flat, immediate no. He stayed the whole afternoon. When I shivered harder, he draped his own blazer over the thin infirmary blanket. When my forehead beaded with sweat, he found a cloth, wet it with cool water, and dabbed at my temples with a gentleness that didn't match anything I'd seen from him in public. Hours later, when I finally surfaced enough to focus, I found him holding my hand. Fingers laced loosely through mine, his thumb tracing slow circles into my palm like he'd been doing it a while and didn't realize he'd started. You're an idiot, he whispered, voice cracking with something that wasn't anger. His thumb kept moving, walking home in that thin excuse for a jacket. Nobody had taken care of me like this. Not in this life, not in my old one. where the closest thing to a support system had been a coworker occasionally covering my shift when I texted that I was dying. I looked at William, exhausted, disheveled, holding my hand like it mattered, and something in my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the fever. I squeezed his hand back, as hard as I could manage. It wasn't much. It said everything anyway. "I see you, thank you. I'm here." "You look worse than I feel," I rasped, because apparently even at 90% unconscious I couldn't resist an opening that easy. "When's the last time you slept, Ashford? Or does the Ice King not require sleep, just Wi-Fi and spite?" He let out a short, surprised laugh, the tension in his shoulders finally breaking. "You're delirious. I'm always like this. You're just usually asleep for it." The nurse, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patterson, who had clearly seen every possible permutation of teenage drama in her 20 years at Blackwood, poked her head in around 4 to check my temperature and found William still exactly where she'd left him. "You do know he's going to live," she said, not unkindly, checking the thermometer. "It's a fever, not a house fire." "I'm aware," William said, in the tone of a man who had personally verified this fact through extensive independent research. "You've missed 2 classes." "I'm aware of that too." Patterson looked between the two of us, me, pale and sniffling under a designer blazer that cost more than her monthly car payment, and William, hunched forward in a plastic chair like he was standing guard over the crown jewels, and something in her face softened into the specific expression adults get when they've figured out a piece of gossip 3 weeks before the rest of the school does. "Well," she said, patting William's shoulder on her way out, "make sure he drinks water." Whatever the word enemies was supposed to mean between us had dissolved somewhere around that infirmary cot, replaced with something I didn't have a name for yet either. A week later, fully recovered, I noticed things had shifted for good. The stolen glances lasted longer. The accidental touches, a hand brushing mine passing a textbook, his palm against my back guiding me through a doorway, had gotten less accidental and a lot more charged. For William, apparently, it was torture. He told me later he'd started staring at my mouth when I yawned, at my throat when I swallowed water, and hating himself a little for it every time, because alphas at Blackwood were supposed to be composed, controlled, above wanting things this obviously. I, for my part, missed him on weekends in a way that embarrassed me. I caught myself smiling at nothing, staring at my phone waiting for a text that just said nap. I was, if I'm honest, waiting for him to catch up to the thing I'd already figured out somewhere between the pillow and the rooftop. That I liked him. Genuinely, inconveniently, against every instinct a man who'd been burned by exactly 0 relationships in his adult life should have had. Tyler noticed before William did, which felt like a special kind of cosmic joke. "You're like gone for him," he said at lunch one day, watching me stare across the cafeteria at William arguing passionately with a teacher about a debate rubric. "It's kind of gross, honestly. You used to have standards." "I have 0 standards," I said honestly. "That's basically my whole personality now." "Congrats, I guess," Tyler said, and miracle of miracles, actually sounded like he meant it. It happened during another tutoring session, golden hour again, because apparently the universe has a favorite lighting setup for this specific relationship. I'd succumbed to my pillow, head resting on the desk. William wasn't studying. He was watching me, his own textbook forgotten, heart going like a snare drum against his ribs. His words, later, not mine, because I was asleep for the build-up. I woke to find him leaning over me, one arm braced on the back of my chair, the other on the desk, effectively caging me in. His face was close. His expression was somewhere between desperate and furious at his own desperation. "I don't care about your reputation anymore," he said, voice low and rough, the words coming out like they'd been dammed up for weeks. "I don't care who you were supposed to be, or what you did before, or any of it. Why is it that the only time I'm at peace is when you're asleep next to me? Why do I think about your stupid hoodie, and the way you mumble in your sleep, and the way you smile right before you wake up? It's you, it's been you since the essay." His confession hung there in the warm classroom air, and he looked, for the first time since I'd met him, genuinely, completely terrified, like he'd handed over something breakable and was bracing for me to drop it. "Say something," he said, voice cracking slightly on the second word. "Please. Anything." "Give me a second," I mumbled, still swimming up from sleep. "I just woke up, and you're saying the most words you've ever said to me at once. My brain needs to catch up to your feelings. It's rude to just unload like that. Daniel, I'm getting there. I blinked up at him properly, taking in the whole picture, jaw tight, eyes wide and unguarded in a way I'd genuinely never seen, hands braced like the desk was the only thing keeping him upright. Every instinct in this half-asleep body of mine, old and new, was pointed the same direction toward him, and had been for a while now, if I was being honest with myself. For the record, I said, you didn't need the whole speech. I've liked you since the pillow. Definitely since you threatened Tyler with parking lot camera footage like a man in a heist movie. I felt no fear, no hesitation. Just a deep, settling sense of finally. I reached up slow, sleep-heavy, and cupped his cheek. His skin was warm, faint stubble against my palm, his eyes going wide and then soft. Stop thinking so loud, I murmured and pulled him down. The kiss was soft, a little clumsy, tasted faintly like the peppermint tea he was always drinking. Tentative at first, a question, until he made a small, shaky sound against my mouth and the kiss deepened into something surer. When we finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, he let out a breathless laugh. I've been wanting to do that for weeks. Good job, I mumbled, eyes already drifting shut again, hands still on his cheek. Nap time. For real this time. I fell asleep sitting up, head on his shoulder, and he just sat there holding me, grinning like an idiot, watching the sunset paint his new boyfriend gold. 3 months later, the original plot of Alpha's Golden Boy was a distant, laughable footnote. No public humiliation, no dramatic downfall. Just a slow, steady rhythm of two people falling asleep on each other, figuratively and, increasingly, literally. I was still failing math. This felt like an immutable law of the universe, right up there with gravity, and the fact that my gray hoodie had permanently relocated to William's closet. But now I had a very dedicated, very handsome, very easily distracted private tutor. We were in his room on a Saturday, a space that had somehow become as familiar to me as my old apartment, all clean lines and the faint smell of cedar, one wall of windows looking out over the water. I'd claimed the armchair immediately, the way a cat claims a sunbeam. Okay, William said, sitting on the edge of his bed with a textbook open. Gianti. Proofs. We're getting through 2 today. I made a non-committal sound from the depths of the armchair, watching him through half-closed eyes. Daniel, focus. I am focused, I said. I'm focused on you. His ears went predictably pink. That's not. You're supposed to be focused on the triangle. There's a triangle? Where? He threw a pillow at me. I let it bounce off my hoodie and hit the floor without moving to pick it up, just smiled the slow, sleepy smile that I'd learned did things to him he pretended it didn't. You're impossible, he sighed, already closing the textbook. He knew when he was beaten. He got up, crossed the room, and looked down at me with an expression that had gone soft in a way the rest of Blackwood never got to see. Scoot over. I shifted, and he squeezed into the armchair beside me, a genuinely terrible fit for 2 teenage boys, neither of us complaining once. I tucked myself against his side, head finding its spot on his shoulder. This is better than triangles, I mumbled. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. You're going to fail your exams. Worth it. We stayed like that as the afternoon light shifted gold across the floor, his arm around my waist, my breathing evening out into sleep. To the rest of Blackwood, William Ashford remained exactly what he'd always been. Perfect posture, precise answers, a single raised eyebrow enough to end an argument. But the people who looked closely noticed the way his expression softened, just for a second, whenever a gray hoodie walked through the door. They noticed the extra hot chocolate he'd leave on my desk before first period. They noticed the texts that made the corner of his mouth twitch. Nap. Hungry. Dreamed about you last night. It was a math lecture, do better. And the way he never once looked embarrassed anymore when people caught him carrying my backpack. The news that William Ashford and I were officially, publicly together broke the way most things at Blackwood broke. Badly, loudly, and with several inaccurate embellishments. By the time it made its way around the school, versions of the story ranged from they've been secretly together since freshman year to a genuinely baffling rumor that William had transferred me to Blackwood specifically to win me back from a rival prep school, which would have required a level of long-term scheming neither of us possessed even a fraction of the energy for. The reality, when people finally saw it in person, William carrying my backpack without being asked, dropping a cold brew on my desk before homeroom like clockwork, occasionally forgetting to maintain his usual composed distance in the hallway and just resting a hand on the small of my back instead, was somehow both more and less dramatic than any rumor. More because nobody had predicted the Ice King would be this openly, unapologetically soft. Less because there was no scandal to it at all. Just two people who liked each other, being visibly happy about it in a school that had spent 2 years betting money on the opposite outcome. Tyler and his crew eventually got the message and kept their distance. Not because William threatened them again, but because, as one of them apparently admitted to a friend, there's no point bullying a guy who genuinely could not care less. Which, frankly, is the nicest thing anyone in this novel has ever said about me. 2 weeks before winter break, William got his revenge on Tyler anyway, the petty, harmless kind. He arranged, through student council, for Tyler to be assigned the single most humiliating job at the winter formal, mascot duty, dressed as the Blackwood Raven, for the entire dance. Tyler spent 3 hours in a foam bird costume, handing out programs, while the entire junior class filmed it for their stories. Nobody got hurt, everybody laughed. William called it civic responsibility. I called it the funniest thing I'd seen since transmigrating. They walked home together every day, the long way, through Volunteer Park, where the last of the fall leaves gave way to bare branches, and the two of them became just a normal fact of scenery to the dog walkers and the kids chasing pigeons. Even when William had student council meetings, I'd find a bench, pull my hood up, and nap until he was free. It was never a question. It just was. Winter formal happened 3 weeks later, and, because the universe apparently runs on a strict quota of embarrassing teenage milestones, William asked me in the single most extravagant, over-engineered way possible for a boy who otherwise treated public displays of affection like a structural liability. I walked into homeroom to find my desk buried under a small mountain of coffee cups, each one from a different Seattle coffee shop, arranged to spell out "Will you go with me" in a handwriting so careful it looked typed. Half the junior class was crowded in the doorway filming it. "This is a lot of caffeine," I said, staring at the display, for a guy asking a known insomniac-adjacent nap enthusiast to a school dance. "You could just say yes," William said, arms crossed, ears already pink, clearly regretting every logistical choice that had led to this moment in front of an audience. I could. I picked up one of the cups and took a sip. Cold brew, exactly how I liked it, because of course he'd remembered. Or I could make you sweat for a minute. "You've made me suffer through geometry for months. Feels fair, Daniel. Fine, yes, obviously yes. You didn't need $40 of oat milk lattes for this, you know." "I know," he said, visibly relieved, already reaching to pull his phone out to text his mother the news, because apparently the Ashford family group chat had been anxiously awaiting an update. I wanted to. We went to winter formal together 3 weeks later, and I fell asleep against his shoulder during the slow song, Standing Up, which somehow became the single most reposted moment of the entire dance, more than the actual king and queen announcement. William didn't seem to mind. He just kept one arm looped around my waist and swayed us both slowly in place, humming slightly off-key along with a song neither of us particularly liked, and told everyone who asked that I was recharging. Meeting William's father happened sooner than either of us planned, mostly because Richard Ashford did not believe in advance notice. Richard Ashford, 48, Alpha, CEO of the Ashford Group, the kind of man who wears a suit to family dinner and calls it casual. He showed up at the house one Saturday while William and I were sprawled across the living room floor, textbooks abandoned in favor of a nap that had, predictably, absorbed the entire study session. I woke up to a deep, unfamiliar voice saying, "So this is the young man who's been distracting my son from his college applications," and nearly gave myself whiplash sitting up. William was on his feet in half a second, a full inch straighter than I'd ever seen him, which I hadn't thought was physically possible. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming into town." Clearly. Richard's eyes moved to me, unreadable, assessing, the exact same sharp calculation his son did when he thought nobody was watching. "You're Daniel, guilty," I said, still half-tangled in a throw blanket, because apparently I'd inherited the entire family's love of aggressive coziness. "Sorry, I'd stand up properly, but I just woke up and my legs haven't agreed to the plan yet." There was a pause. A long one. William's jaw was doing the tight thing it did when he was bracing for impact. Then Richard Ashford, CEO, real estate titan, a man whose face had been on the cover of a regional business magazine twice, let out a short laugh, surprised out of him the exact same way his son's had been 3 months earlier. "Huh," he said, looking between us. You're right, Will. He's nothing like the file said. What file? I asked, alarmed. Don't worry about the file, William said quickly, physically stepping between us like he could block the sentence retroactively. His father just smiled, a real one, brief but genuine, and told us to order something that wasn't takeout for once, and left almost as abruptly as he'd arrived. William exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for the entire visit. That went well, I offered. That went shockingly well, he said, sitting back down beside me, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. He usually hates everyone I bring home. I'm just that charming. You fell asleep within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. Exactly. Disarming. It's a strategy. He shook his head, but he was smiling, and later, when I asked what exactly was in the file, he admitted his father ran a background check on anyone William brought home more than twice, a fact that should have been alarming and somehow just made me laugh until my ribs hurt. Old Daniel's file, apparently, had been thick with academic probation notices and a suspiciously specific incident report involving a stink bomb in the boys' locker room freshman year. New Daniel had, in 6 months, single-handedly turned that file around, simply by falling asleep in front of the man in charge of it. A year and a half later, graduation arrived on a bright June afternoon, sun blazing over the football field, where 600 folding chairs sat in careful rows and every parent in attendance was armed with a camera aimed at their own particular kid. William gave the valedictorian speech, the real one, entirely his own words, no plagiarism scandal in sight, the exact essay Mr. Whitfield had read at that fall convocation, expanded into something sharper and funnier, and more honest than anything a straight-A overachiever was supposed to be allowed to write about his own father's expectations. He looked for me in the crowd exactly once, mid-speech, found me instantly. I was, predictably, fighting off a nap in the heat, propped against Tyler's shoulder of all people, our old rivalry having fully calcified into an easy, low-stakes friendship somewhere around junior spring, and the corner of his mouth twitched up for half a second before he found his place in the speech again. Afterward, in the chaos of gowns and flying caps and parents crying over children they'd apparently expected to stay 17 forever, William found me by the bleachers, tie already loosened, diploma rolled in one fist. You slept through the first 10 minutes, he said, not quite managing to sound annoyed. I heard the parts that mattered. Something about legacy, something about hard work, something about a boy who fell asleep in first period and never really woke up. I grinned at his visible surprise. Tyler recapped for me. He's very thorough now. Growth. William laughed. The real one. Easy and unguarded. The one that used to make hallways gasp and now didn't surprise anyone at all. Because everyone at Blackwood had spent 2 years watching the Ice King thaw completely, in public, without a single ounce of shame about it. Come on, he said, holding out his hand, diploma and all. I want to walk you home. The long way. Obviously, I said, and took it. The kitchen smells like burnt garlic, which is entirely my fault, and William is standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the exact same unimpressed eyebrow he's been giving me since we were 17. You said you'd watch it, he says. I was watching it. I was watching it very closely with my eyes closed. Daniel, it's character. Some chefs call it char. I call it the sauce has ambition. He crosses the kitchen of our Capitol Hill apartment. Small, sunlit, decidedly not an Ashford Group property despite his father's repeated, increasingly desperate offers of a penthouse, and takes the pan off the burner before it can commit further crimes. He's 24 now, a couple of years into running the Ashford Group's Pacific Northwest Hospitality Division, and somehow still has the specific talent of making disapproval look like foreplay. How is it, I ask, watching him scrape the disaster into the sink, that you can negotiate a $100 million hotel deal and you still can't let me burn a little garlic in peace? Because, he says, not looking up, I married a man who once slept through an entire fire drill, and I've learned to worry preemptively. That was one time, and the alarm was very quiet. The building was, in fact, on fire. A little bit on fire. He turns around, and there it is, the smile he still tries to suppress in public, but never bothers to hide from me anymore. Soft at the edges, eyes crinkling. Married 8 months now, and he still gets that look sometimes, like he can't quite believe his own luck, which is objectively ridiculous, because I'm the one who married a guy who irons his pajamas. Come here, he says, holding out a hand. I go, obviously. I've never once turned down an invitation to be lazy in his general direction. And he pulls me in against his chest, chin resting on the top of my head, both of us swaying slightly to no music in a kitchen that still smells faintly of crime. He proposed here, actually, almost a year ago, in this exact kitchen, badly, mid-argument about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, which is either the least romantic or most accurate story of our entire relationship, depending on who's telling it. He'd had the ring in his coat pocket for 2 weeks, apparently, waiting for a moment, and then simply cracked under the pressure of me being smug about pineapple and blurted it out with a spoon still in his hand. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. He still claims I ruined the speech he'd written. I still maintain a good proposal shouldn't need a rehearsal. We're ordering takeout, he says. Again, I know a great line cook if you're interested. I married him. He burns garlic. With ambition, I remind him, and he laughs. The real laugh, the one that used to make hallways full of teenagers gasp, and now just belongs to me, in a kitchen, on a Tuesday, for no reason at all except that this is what our life is now. The wedding itself happened last spring, small and outdoors, on a bluff overlooking the Sound because William refused, on principle, to get married anywhere his father could turn into a networking opportunity. I fell asleep during the rehearsal dinner toast, my own toast, which I was supposed to be giving, and had to be gently nudged awake by my best man, who happened to be Tyler, of all people, because 6 years and 1 mascot costume apparently heals most grudges. William didn't marry a man who'd magically transformed into a morning person. He married exactly who he fell for on that rooftop. Somebody unbothered, unhurried, entirely too comfortable falling asleep at inconvenient moments, who happened to love him back with the same stubborn, quiet certainty he'd loved me with since he was 17, and pretending not to care about a boy in a gray hoodie. Later, we end up on the couch, my head in his lap, a true crime documentary playing that neither of us is watching. His fingers are in my hair, slow and absent, the same steady, patient touch he's had since he was 17 and gently prying a hoodie off my sleeping face. Hey, I say, eyes already closing, voice already going thick with sleep. Best decision I ever made was deciding not to bother with the whole villain thing. I feel him smile against the top of my head. Second best. What's the first? Falling asleep on me in first period, he says, and never really waking up. I don't have a comeback for that. I just tuck closer, listen to his heartbeat under my ear the way I did on a rooftop 6 years ago, and let myself drift off, safe, warm, and exactly where I'm supposed to be. Somewhere in the apartment, the documentary narrator is explaining a crime nobody's listening to. Outside, Seattle does its usual thing, gray sliding into evening, rain starting up soft against the window. William's hand stays in my hair, unhurried, like he has nowhere else in the world he'd rather be, which 6 years running now, he keeps insisting is true, no plot to fulfill. No villain arc waiting in the wings, no golden boy rival to sabotage, no 40-minute countdown to public humiliation ticking away somewhere in a manila folder. Just naps and bad takeout decisions, and a man who never once needed me to be anyone other than tired, lazy, and completely, hopelessly his. It was, in every way that mattered, worth waking up for. And that's the story of the school bully who chose peace, and got the alpha anyway. If you enjoyed Daniel and William's slow burn, follow the channel so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment with your favorite nap scene. See you next time.